watching Capitol Connection from the Illinois State Capitol.
One of the busiest state agencies this summer and this fall has been the Department of Agriculture. With the rollout of legal recreational marijuana, there was the addition of hemp growth, plus disastrous floods that wrecked much of the farming community earlier this year. The Department of Agriculture has had more than its fair share of work. Joining us now is the Director of the Department of Agriculture, John Sullivan. Good to have you with us.
Good to be back, Mark.
These pesky state lawmakers may be cooking up a plan to put even more work on your desk with the regulation of CBD. This is the part of marijuana or cannabis that you don't get high from, but it's often used in medicinal. Right. This has not yet been passed into law, but what is the concern with and around CBD? I think I've seen signs for it in front of gas stations, dollar stores, all over the place. Seems everyone's selling it these days.
Absolutely. So, and it's not a concern just in Illinois. It's actually all across the country, including, at the federal level, they're looking at some additional regulation as well. But so CBD oil is currently not regulated. There is no labeling requirements. There's no certification or verifying or testing of the product, and so there has been examples of where what the bottle said and what was actually in the bottle did not line up. So there's been some legislation introduced here in Illinois that would require the Department of Ag to oversee a testing and labeling of CBD oil, and again, something that I think there's a lot of concern, justified, honestly. But I'm not sure if it's we need to just specifically address it here in Illinois, because obviously it's transported across state lines, and you get into all sorts of issues with regard to that.
It sounds like you'd like to see a federal fix.
I think absolutely. I think the FDA needs to regulate it. If it needs to be regulated, they need to do it. They need to at least set out the rules and the standards for it. Barring that, the feds have been very slow on reacting to the regulations and rules and regulations with regard to hemp overall, but certainly CBD as well. So, but here at the state level, there's been, as we talked about, a bill introduced. We're reviewing that bill. We're talking to the sponsor. A lot of the requirements of the legislation, we have no expertise and no personnel. And we start talking about testing of the product. We don't have anybody or the equipment to test it. So, that certainly draws concerns for us.
I think it was reporters at the Associated Press who first started to shine a light on this. They went out and bought a few dozen samples at various locations, took it to a lab, tested it, and found out that what says is CBD oil, actually, like as you mentioned, or alluded to there, had traces or additives, all kinds of different things. Some of them didn't have CBD in it at all.
Yeah, is that right? Wow.
And that's my recollection of it. And so, to be clear, is it your understanding that there's anything dangerous inherently with CBD, or just that people aren't being honest about what's contained inside that package?
So I've not heard of anything being in there that was dangerous. I think it was more of a mislabeling, saying that it was a certain percent CBD oil, and it did not have that content in it. I spent a week out in New Mexico, actually, at a conference of state ag directors from all over the country. I think there was almost 45 of my peers there, and we had a couple of presentations from the FDA and the USDA with regard to CBD oil. So it's an issue that all across the country everybody's discussing right now. And they certainly gave some examples of where there were mislabeling, and certainly the what was in the bottle wasn't what the label said. So, and they were pushing very strongly for the FDA to take a stand and take a position and require some tougher testing and rules and regulations.
So if state lawmakers come to you in veto session or in the spring session next year and say, we want the state level to regulate this, you're going to need more resources at the Department of Agriculture to carry that out?
We're absolutely going to need more resources, but again, and we've already had some of those discussions with sponsors of the legislation, and I think that there needs to be some other agencies involved, not just the Department of Ag. I think they turned to the Department of Ag because we obviously did the rules and regulations for hemp, but when you get onto the food safety side of it, which is really kind of what we're talking about, perhaps there's some other agencies need to have some input and expertise as well.
Sure. Your agency has also been very intricately involved with the legalization of recreational marijuana in terms of regulating there as well.
Yep.
There's been some reporting recently and some people expressing some concern that when New Year's Day arrives and people start showing up to buy marijuana, if there's a surge at the counter and people are buying up all the product, will there be enough? Will there be enough supply to match the demand? What's your view on that? Are we in good shape?
So first of all, the department is responsible for the permitting and regulating of the growers, processors, transportation, and the craft grow portion of that legislation. So that's where our expertise is. That's where we're spending our time and resources right now, making sure that we have those rules and regulations up. To the question of whether there's going to be enough product available on January 1, there were a number of studies, some independent, most of them independently done, when they were passing the legislation. Some of those studies said there wasn't near going to be enough capacity. Others said, yes, if you allow the current growers, so the current growers and processors of medicinal marijuana right now, if you allow them to expand, which a lot of that is happening right now, that there will be enough product because it's, on day one, we're not going to start, we're not going to be at capacity. In other words, the amount of interest is going to grow over time as more and more people, become comfortable with it. So as to whether there's going to be enough product, I'm certainly not qualified to answer that question. All we're trying to do is make sure that the current growers, if they are applying to expand their operation, we worked with them very closely to make sure that that gets done in a timely manner. So we want to do everything that we don't want to hinder it. We want to help it, the production as much as possible.
And certainly some of those medicinal companies that they have a brick and mortar presence, all they have to do is multiply what they have in place. That's an easier process, I believe, than starting from the ground up.
It's absolutely an easier process. Plus, it could be done because of the legislation allowed for that expansion. It can be done on a more timely basis, as opposed to a whole new facility being, permitted and regulated, and talk about the construction and how big it's going to be and where it's going to be located. That in itself is a fairly, significant and can be somewhat of a lengthy process.
I think the last...
And honestly, those permits are not even available yet. So.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Is that process on track? The permitting of the newer...
So I had an update this past week and with our staff as far as where we are, and we set out a timetable. Once the legislation was passed and signed into law, we set out a timetable of what our requirements are at the Department of are on that schedule, and where we needed to be, and we feel comfortable that we are online to have everything in place and ready to go January 1. That's the first deadline that we're looking at. Obviously, we have other deadlines going on through next year. But as of right now, as far as writing and drafting the rules and the regulations, which is what we are doing, what our staff is doing, we feel pretty comfortable at this point.
And cities and towns across Illinois are taking votes even now to figure out whether or not they want to allow the sale of recreational marijuana within their city limits, whether they want to add a city tax or not. All of these discussions happening at the local level simultaneously while your agency is carrying some of this out. I want to switch gears for a quick minute here. Last time we had you on, I was trying to get a sense from you and from the department what the harvest season was going to look like. How would we punctuate what was a tumultuous and turbulent growing season early on? What would that look like? Do we have a better... You weren't quite prepared to say just yet because the harvest season was just sort of getting underway. Mm-hmm. Do we have a better idea as we sit here today what farmers have to show for this rough year? Yep,
absolutely. So, here we are, middle of October, latter part of October. The harvest has started, and I would say that overall, generally speaking, yields are better than what most farmers anticipated. They're certainly not to the level they were last year, which, of course, last year was an extreme, excellent year, one of the best most producers saw. We're not at those levels, but given the year that farmers have had, and especially with regard to the weather, yields are better than what most people anticipated. I guess the biggest concern now is, and I saw some numbers from the USDA this morning, but here across the Corn Belt, about roughly 25% of the corn has been harvested and around 25% of soybeans, generally speaking. Those numbers are either a half or 3/4 less than what they normally are on average. So normally we're in the 60, 70, even up to 80% range on harvest of corn and soybeans. So we're well behind where we normally are this time of year. And so I guess the point I'm trying to make is there is a lot of crop to be harvested. The corn and soybeans that were planted early have generally yielded pretty well. The biggest concern now, I think, is the corn and soybeans that got planted, for example, in June, which is 30 days later than it normally should have been or more. That hasn't been harvested because it's not mature. We don't have as many heat growing units during a day as you get into fall. So whether that crop is going to mature and dry out in a timely manner is yet to be seen.
That's fascinating. And as farmers are harvesting all this, they, of course, want to go sell it on the market, and I want to ask you about trade and how Illinois is positioned to sell all these crops. President Trump earlier this month tweeted that China has already started to buy our products. He's trying to say there's a breakthrough in this sort of trade standoff. Certainly the markets reacted positively to the initial word there, but my understanding was there was a deal in principle. It's not really completed just yet. So is there any sign that there is a breakthrough in the Chinese market? Are we able to sell our goods there just yet?
I would say possibly. So there are definitely, the Chinese have purchased some corn and soybeans and meat. That is a positive sign. So they have made some purchases. In the big picture, they're small, but at least they're making some purchases. That was step number one. Step number two is when the president came out and said that they've reached a tentative agreement with China with regard to trade. That's what really, the markets really reacted positively. For one day, they were up significantly grain and especially grain. I think the concern now is after that initial, rise in that day, they basically leveled off and nothing's happened since. But we don't know the details, So the president has said we've reached this tentative deal, but there have been no details with regard to that. And we've kind of heard that story before, so I think people are a little bit skeptical. I think more importantly on the trade side is that there was a significant agreement reached with Japan, and I think that was certainly a step forward, and it certainly helped to buoy commodity prices. I'm not saying it's put a lot of oomph behind it, but it certainly has prevented it from going down. So I think that the Japanese deal was significant. And then here in Illinois we signed a memo of agreement for the Taiwanese to purchase corn and soybeans from Illinois and other Midwestern states. So that was also a very positive step. So there have been some small things that have happened, but really the China market is they're the big gorilla in the room, right? So they carry so much weight with regard to purchasing our exports. That deal needs to be reached sooner rather than later.
Sure, fastest growing economy in the world, the second largest economy in the world, certainly a big player in that. But also, as farmers also sell their product in the market, there was, at the Farm Progress Show, a lot of consternation, a lot of debate and concern among farmers about this rule at the U.S. EPA that would give waivers to, essentially, they wanted to make sure they could sell their markets to provide for this ethanol blend of fuel, but Big Oil and the U.S. EPA had sort of gone back and forth on this. Just this week, there's reporting out of Washington that some farmers feel there's been a bait and switch, that in fact the U.S. EPA has reneged on that promise to help farmers sell their corn into that market. How big of a deal is this? How big of a market is that for farmers in Illinois? And how important is it that is secured for them to be able to continue selling?
It's hugely important. When you start looking at the number of bushels of corn that's turned into ethanol, and I don't know, I'm not going to tell you what that number is, but it's a significant amount of bushels that gets turned into ethanol. So it's been a seesaw. It's been an up and down. So first of all, the federal EPA granted a waiver to the 30 smaller refineries that they did not have to use ethanol in their production. So that was devastating to the ethanol industry. Then the president came and got involved with it and said, okay, we're going to reverse that and we're going to have to come up with a compromise, and so everybody was feeling better. And then here just last week we got word that EPA is again pushing forward with the waiver on from those 30 small refineries. So it's just been up and down, and but the impact of the lack of production of ethanol, what that has done for the corn market specifically is quite dramatic. When you take that corn out of the ethanol production side of it, and so then there's an abundance of corn on the market, it's going to be significant.
That's interesting to watch and see happen as oil and corn sort of compete for some of the same market share. It's interesting. I think sometimes geopolitics impacts some of that as well, but it's an interesting thing to watch.
Yesterday I heard on the radio, I actually was in the tractor yesterday in the combine doing some work on my own farm, but they were talking about this very issue, and the analysis that this one commentator presented was, the president's being pulled both ways. He's got friends in in oil, and he has friends in the ag sector, and he's kind of being pulled both ways. And I think that's why we've seen this seesaw. First there's going to be an agreement, and ethanol production is going to be taken care of, and then it gets pulled back, and it leans more in the favor of big oil. So I think it's really a difficult decision that he's probably in the middle of.
Is it appropriate for you? Can you reach out to the White House directly? Would you ask Governor Pritzker to reach out and remind the president that farmers have sort of stuck with him, I think politically, through a lot of these tumultuous trade wars and things, and make the case that this deal should be awarded in favor of farmers, or is that something that you'd be comfortable doing?
I think there's two things. I would be comfortable doing it. I think there's two things. Certainly, Governor Pritzker, a letter from him to the president would be more significant than coming, obviously, from myself. But I think also our federal legislators, our congressmen and U.S. senators, I think that would be more appropriate. I did see Senator Durbin here in the last 10 days or so. We actually discussed this very issue. He's very much on top of it and aware of it. I know that Congresswoman Bustos is obviously very involved, as well as LaHood, Congressman LaHood. So I think those folks are aware of it. They're kind of in, I think they're trying to get the president's ear as to who they're representing in the Corn Belt here in the states and their constituency.
All right, Director Sullivan, thanks so much for joining us.
Good to be here, Mark. Thanks. Appreciate the opportunity.
All right, we're back in just a moment.